Hello, friends. Before we dive into today's story, please help me grow this channel by subscribing, sharing this video with others, and don't forget to hit that like button. Now, let's get started with our story. Christmas dinner was supposed to be about family, warmth, and celebration. The house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon pie. The tree glittered with ornaments, and everyone was gathered around the table laughing. But then, in the middle of that joy, my father-in-law, Conrad, leaned back in his chair, looked straight at me, and asked with a smug grin, "How does it feel to be a loser?" His words cut through the laughter like a knife. Everyone burst out laughing at his joke. My brother-in-law, Devin, nearly choked on his wine. My mother-in-law, Helen, tried to hide her smile, and even my wife, Leora, gave a nervous chuckle to break the tension. But I didn't laugh. I sat there steady, my son Owen's wide eyes fixed on me as if waiting to see what I would do. I forced a smile and calmly asked a question of my own. "How does it feel to know that this loser won't be paying your bills anymore?" In that instant, the room went silent. The laughter stopped. Conrad's face turned pale. His smirk vanished, and for the first time all night he had nothing to say. The day had started like any other holiday morning. Leora and I woke up early. The house still quiet, the faint hum of the heater the only sound. Our son Owen came running into our room before the sun was even up, his excitement spilling over as he tugged at the blanket. "Dad, Mom, it's Christmas. Can I open just one gift before we leave?" His little face was glowing, his hair sticking up in every direction, and as tired as I felt, I could not say no to him. We let him open one box, and when he pulled out the toy truck he had been begging for, his squeal filled the house with joy. For a moment everything felt perfect, but I knew what the evening would bring. I knew what waited for us at Conrad's house. Christmas was never just Christmas there. It was a performance, a stage where Conrad played the role of the proud patriarch, cracking jokes and making sure everyone remembered he was in charge. What the rest of the family never admitted, though, was that the life Conrad paraded around as his own accomplishment had been kept afloat by me. I was the one who stepped in quietly, paying the bills he could not cover, wiring money for the house repairs he could not afford, even writing the checks that put Devin through college. He treated it like a given, as if I owed it to him simply because I married his daughter. The drive over was quiet, as it usually was. Leora could sense my tension even when I tried to hide it. She reached across the console and squeezed my hand. "I know tonight is always hard for you," she said softly, "but thank you for doing this. They need us." She meant it from a place of love. She had watched her mother struggle under Conrad's pride and poor decisions for years. She had seen Devin skate by, relying on handouts, never once thanking the person who kept bailing him out. She wanted to believe that helping them was the right thing to do, that family meant sacrifice. I wanted to believe it too, but every year the cost weighed heavier on me. When we pulled up, the house looked warm and inviting from the outside. Strings of lights framed the roof. A glowing wreath hung on the door, and I could hear faint Christmas music playing as soon as we stepped out of the car. Inside, Helen greeted us first. She was always gentle, her voice soft, her smile kind. She hugged Owen tightly and whispered, "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." She hugged me too, but there was always a hesitancy in her embrace, as if she wanted to say something, but never did. Devin was already in the living room, drink in hand, legs stretched out on the recliner as if he owned the place. He gave me that same smirk he always did, the one that said he knew I was the one making his life comfortable, but he would never acknowledge it. "Hey man," he said casually, lifting his glass. "Glad you could make it. Hope work's not grinding you down too much." His words carried that fake concern that made me want to clench my fists. Conrad arrived last, his entrance as loud as always. He slapped me on the back so hard my drink nearly spilled. "There's my son-in-law," he boomed. "The man of the hour, the quiet one. Always working, never talking. Don't worry. We'll get you to loosen up tonight." Everyone laughed and I smiled politely, but inside my chest I felt the familiar weight pressing down. Dinner was served beautifully. Helen had spent the entire day cooking, and the table was covered with roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pies that filled the room with warmth. Owen sat beside me, his eyes darting from the food to the presents under the tree. His innocence a reminder of why I kept enduring these nights. He deserved a happy Christmas, even if it meant I had to swallow my pride. As the food was passed around, small talk filled the air. Devin boasted about his new job that Conrad had bragged into existence for him, a position he only held because of connections, not skill. Helen talked about the church service she had attended earlier in the day. Conrad interrupted often, making himself the center of attention, telling stories that exaggerated his accomplishments and painted him as the family hero. I sat quietly as I always did, chewing my food, smiling when appropriate, laughing when expected. But inside I was already counting the sacrifices I had made, the extra shifts I worked, the savings I dipped into, the vacations I gave up. All so Conrad could stand at the head of the table and laugh without a worry in the world. I thought of the time I paid his medical bill after his heart scare, and he never once said thank you. I thought of the time the roof leaked and I wrote the check that fixed it, while he told everyone he handled it himself. I thought of Devon's tuition payments, each one a reminder that Conrad's pride came at my expense. Leora glanced at me every now and then, her eyes searching mine for patience. She knew what it cost me to sit there. She loved her father, but she also knew the truth. She was caught in the middle, and I did not blame her. This was her family, her blood. I was the outsider who had given too much and received nothing but scorn in return. Still, I reminded myself why I was there. For Owen, for Leora, for the idea of family, even if it was one-sided. I told myself I could make it through one more night, that I could swallow a few more insults, and that it would all be worth it when the night ended and we returned home to peace. But as I looked at Conrad, laughing louder than anyone else, his glass raised high, his jokes biting deeper, something inside me shifted. For years I had told myself I was doing the right thing, that providing without recognition was a mark of strength. But as the night unfolded, I began to realize I was not building respect. I was feeding their entitlement, and I knew before the evening was over something had to change. The first half hour of dinner was filled with the usual rhythm of family chatter. Plates clinked as Helen urged everyone to take more food. Owen sat happily beside me, scooping mashed potatoes onto his plate and humming the tune of a carol he had heard on the radio. For him, the evening was exactly what a child's Christmas should be: food, family, and the promise of gifts under the tree. Watching him helped steady me, but my eyes kept drifting toward Conrad, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. Conrad had always been the kind of man who could not stand silence. He filled every gap with a story or a joke, usually at someone else's expense. That night was no different. He began with safe topics, teasing Helen about overcooking the turkey, poking fun at Devon for never helping around the house, and even making a joke about his own expanding waistline. Everyone laughed, relieved to be entertained. Then, as often happened, his focus shifted toward me. He asked about my job in that casual tone that was never really casual. I told him the truth, that work was steady, that I was grateful for what I had, that I was making enough to provide for my family. He nodded but quickly turned it into a performance. "Steady work, huh?" he said, raising his glass. That's another way of saying boring. The man works and works, and what does he have to show for it? No fancy car, no boat, no big house, just steady. Isn't that right, everyone? Laughter bubbled around the table. Devon chuckled loudest, shaking his head as if he could not imagine living such a life. Helen looked down at her plate, pretending to cut her turkey into smaller and smaller pieces. Leora's hand brushed my leg under the table, a silent plea to ignore him. I smiled thinly and took a sip of water. I told myself I could take it, but the word stung. I had worked double shifts, skipped vacations, and cut corners. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I had been funneling so much of what I earned into keeping Conrad's household from crumbling. To hear him frame me as small or unworthy made something in my chest tighten. Conrad was warming up now, encouraged by the laughter. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice booming. "You know what I love about this guy?" he said, pointing directly at me. "He's dependable, always shows up, always pays up. A man like that, he's the perfect son-in-law. You can count on him for everything." The words might have sounded like praise to anyone who did not know the truth, but I knew what he meant. He was reminding everyone that when he fell short, I picked up the pieces. When he wanted to brag about being the provider, I quietly made it possible. The dependability he celebrated was the very thing that had chained me to his pride. Devon laughed again, raising his glass toward me. "Yeah, cheers to the guy who keeps this family going. Without him, we'd all be in trouble." His smirk made it clear he thought it was funny. Leora finally spoke, her voice sharp, with embarrassment. "That's enough, Devon." She looked at her father, too, her eyes pleading with him to stop. But Conrad waved her off with a chuckle. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just having fun. He knows I'm joking. Don't you, son? Conrad asked, turning to me, his face flushed from wine and laughter. I nodded once, but my jaw was tight. My son watched me closely, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. He was too young to understand all the layers of what was happening. But he could sense the tone. Children always can. He knew his grandfather was mocking me, and he was waiting to see how I would react. The laughter died down as people returned to their plates, but Conrad was not finished. He never knew when to quit. After another sip of wine, he leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and grinned. So tell me, he said loudly enough to quiet the table again, how does it feel to be a loser? The word landed with a thud. Loser. It echoed in my head, heavy and sharp. Devin burst out laughing. Helen covered her mouth as if she might cough, but I saw the corners of her lips twitch. Even Leora let out a nervous laugh, not because she agreed, but because she wanted to break the unbearable silence that followed. Only Owen stayed still, his wide eyes locked on me, his face serious in a way that no child's face should have to be on Christmas. In that moment, I realized this was no longer about me swallowing pride for the sake of peace. This was about the kind of example I was setting for my son. Was I teaching him that a man should accept humiliation in silence even when he was the one carrying everyone else? Or was I going to show him that respect must be earned and demanded no matter the cost? I looked around the table. Conrad was still grinning, waiting for me to play along and laugh at myself. Devin leaned back in his chair, smug and satisfied. Helen kept her eyes down. Leora's face was pale, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped her glass. I felt the heat in my chest turn into something steady and cold. The years of sacrifice, the countless checks, the long nights of work, it all came into focus. This was not a joke. This was the moment where I had to decide if I would continue letting them define me as less than I was. I smiled, not out of amusement, but out of certainty. I knew exactly what I was about to say, and I knew it would change everything. When Conrad's laughter rang through the dining room, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The word loser hung in the air, but instead of stinging the way he intended, it clarified everything. For years I had sat at that same table, biting my tongue, pretending his jokes were harmless, pretending his words did not cut deeper with each holiday. But this time was different. My son was watching. Owen's eyes were fixed on me, searching for a lesson in how I handled the insult. If I let it slide again, I would be teaching him that it was acceptable for a man to sacrifice everything and still be treated with contempt. That was not the lesson I wanted him to carry into his life. I set my fork down slowly, careful not to make a sound. I met Conrad's eyes and held them, letting him see that I was not about to play along. His grin faltered slightly as if he realized I was not following the script he expected. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer the silent provider, no longer the man who gave and gave while being treated as less than. I was ready to reclaim my dignity. The decision formed in my mind with a clarity I had never experienced. I would not raise my voice. I would not lash out in anger. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I would use the truth. The truth had more power than any insult. It was the truth that kept him clothed and fed. The truth that kept this house standing. The truth that allowed him to play the role of patriarch while I played the role of ghost. Tonight I would no longer be invisible. Leora noticed the change in me before anyone else. Her hand tightened on my leg under the table, her eyes widening slightly. She whispered, "Please don't." But it was too late. I gave her a reassuring look, not one of anger, but of resolve. This was not about revenge. It was about setting things right. I thought back to every moment that had brought me here. The night Helen called in tears because the mortgage was overdue, and I transferred the money within the hour without asking questions. The hospital bill after Conrad's surgery that I paid in full, so his credit would not be ruined. The thousands that disappeared from my savings to cover Devin's tuition, even though he had never once thanked me. Each memory was fuel, not for rage, but for certainty. Conrad smirked again, misinterpreting my silence. See, he knows I'm right. A good sport, this one takes a hit and keeps on smiling. That's why I like him. He knows his place, the words sealed it. He thought my silence was submission. He mistook my patience for weakness. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. But this smile was not the polite mask I had worn for years. It was the smile of a man who finally understood his own worth. I cleared my throat and the sound cut through the chatter. The room quieted. Devin stopped laughing mid-breath. Helen looked up and even Owen set down his fork. All eyes turned to me. Conrad leaned forward, eager to hear me make a self-deprecating joke, eager to see me confirm his dominance in front of his family. But that was not what he was going to get. The words formed clearly in my mind, sharp and steady. I was going to tell him the truth he had never been forced to face. I was going to tell him that I would no longer carry him, that the lifeline he mocked was the very thing keeping him afloat. He thought he was exposing my weakness, but tonight I would expose his dependence. Leora whispered again. Think about what you're doing. I nodded slightly, but my decision was made. This was not just about me anymore. This was about her as well, about freeing her from the burden of watching her husband be disrespected by the people he supported. It was about freeing Owen from growing up in a house where kindness was mistaken for weakness. I glanced once more at my son. He looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes, and I knew that whatever I said next would stay with him for years. He would remember not only the words, but the way I carried myself, the way I refused to bow to humiliation. This was my chance to show him what strength truly looked like. I turned back to Conrad, and for the first time in my life I felt taller than him. My voice did not shake. My heart did not race. It beat steady, as if it knew this was exactly where I was supposed to be. Conrad, I said, my tone calm and even. You want to know how it feels to be a loser? I'll tell you. It feels like sitting here for years, swallowing your insults while I paid your bills, kept your house standing, and made sure your family had food on this table. It feels like carrying a man who never once had the decency to say thank you. The room froze. Leora gasped quietly. Helen's fork clattered against her plate. Devin sat upright, his smirk gone. Owen's eyes grew wider. Conrad's grin faltered completely, his face flushing red before draining of color. But I was not finished. The turning point was not just in speaking, but in ending the cycle. I leaned forward slightly, still calm, still steady. And from tonight on, it feels like freedom, I said, because this loser will no longer be paying your bills. Silence followed, thick and heavy. For the first time in years, Conrad had nothing to say. His face paled, his mouth opened and closed without a word. The authority he clung to so tightly crumbled in an instant. In that silence, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. The words left my mouth like a final stone cast into still water, and the ripples spread instantly across the room. For years, Conrad had controlled the table with his voice, his laughter, his cutting remarks, but now it was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of Christmas music playing from the living room speakers. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open as if he had not heard me correctly. Helen's fork slipped from her hand and clattered against her plate. She froze, her eyes darting between me and Conrad. Devin's smirk vanished, his glass lowering slowly until it rested on the table with a soft thud. Leora pressed her lips together, her hand still gripping mine under the table, this time with something closer to relief than fear. And Owen, my son, looked at me with wide eyes that shimmered with something new, something I had never seen in him before. Pride. Conrad cleared his throat, trying to laugh it off. You're joking, he said, forcing a chuckle. That's a good one. Real funny. His eyes darted to the others, searching for support, searching for the familiar laughter that had always followed his words. But none came. The silence pressed down heavier with each second. I shook my head. I'm not joking. My voice was steady, calm, louder than I realized, filling the room in a way it never had before. I've paid your mortgage, your medical bills, Devin's tuition. I've covered repairs, groceries, and everything you pretended came from you. And you sit here in front of my son and call me a loser. Devin shifted in his chair, his face red. Wait, you paid my tuition? His voice cracked, the smugness gone. I looked directly at him. Every semester. You think your father did? He never had the money. It came from me. From the hours I worked while you enjoyed your classes without a care. Devin's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted to his father, betrayal plain on his face. For the first time, he saw his father's pride for what it was, a lie built on someone else's sacrifice. Helen looked down at her lap, her hands trembling as she twisted her napkin. She had always known on some level, I suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud stripped away any denial she had left. Tears welled in her eyes. Not only from shame, but from the realization that she had let her husband's arrogance blind her to the truth. Conrad's face grew pale, his bravado collapsing under the weight of my words. He tried to rally, his voice rising in a strained tone. You think you can sit there and embarrass me in front of my family? You think you can walk away after all I've done for them? All you've done? I leaned forward, my voice sharp but still controlled. You've taken. You've mocked. You've leaned on me while pretending you stood tall. You've humiliated me in the same breath you've relied on me. But that ends tonight. The tension broke like glass. Leora, who had sat quietly for so long, finally spoke, her voice strong and unwavering. Dad, he's right. You've treated him horribly while letting him hold this family together. I've watched him work himself to exhaustion so you could sit here and play the proud father. And I let it go on because I didn't want to upset you. But enough is enough. Conrad turned to her, his face etched with disbelief. Leora, you don't mean that. She met his eyes with the steadiness that matched mine. I do. I'm ashamed I didn't say it sooner. The weight of her words fell harder than mine. She was his daughter, his pride, his defender. To hear her side with me, to see her acknowledge the truth, broke something in him. He looked at Helen, but she did not come to his rescue. He looked at Devon, but Devon sat stiff and silent, his face pale. Owen shifted beside me, his small voice breaking the silence. Dad's not a loser. His words were simple, innocent, but they landed with more power than anything else that had been said. Everyone turned to look at him, this little boy sitting at a table of adults, and in that moment he spoke the truth in its purest form. I placed my arm gently around him and said, That's right, Owen, I'm not. And you never let anyone make you feel small when you know the truth about who you are. The room stayed silent, the Christmas lights blinking softly in the background. For the first time in years, Conrad had nothing to say. His authority had crumbled, his laughter silenced, his power gone. I stood, pushing back my chair slowly. Enjoy the rest of your dinner, I said. But from now on, you'll do it without my help. My voice was calm, but the finality in it was undeniable. Conrad's lips trembled as he opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stared at me, pale and broken, stripped of the image he had built so carefully. I knew in that moment he finally understood what he had lost. Leora rose beside me, her hand slipping into mine. She looked at her father one last time, her expression firm. We're done, Dad. We've carried this weight long enough. Together we took Owen's hand and walked toward the door. Behind us, the silence of the table spoke louder than any words. For years, Conrad had laughed at my expense, secure in the belief that I would never speak up, that I would keep carrying the burden quietly. But tonight, the roles had changed. The man he called a loser had taken away the one thing that kept his pride alive, and in doing so, I had given my son a lesson he would never forget. The drive home that night felt different than any other Christmas we had ever spent at Conrad's house. The snow was falling lightly, the roads quiet, and the car filled with a silence that was not heavy but freeing. For the first time in years, I was not carrying the weight of shame or resentment. Instead, I felt a calm strength settle over me, the kind that comes only after you finally do what you should have done long ago. Owen sat in the back seat holding his toy truck, his eyes glowing with the innocence of a child who had just witnessed something important. He did not fully understand the financial history, the years of sacrifice, or the dynamics that poisoned so many dinners, but he understood one thing clearly. His father had stood tall. He had seen me refuse to let someone disrespect me, and he had heard me speak the truth without fear. That was enough. That was the lesson that would stay with him. Leora reached over and rested her head against my shoulder as I drove. I should have said something years ago, she whispered. I let him walk over you because I was afraid of losing my family. But you showed me tonight that family is not about blood if it comes with humiliation. It's about respect. It's about honesty, and you gave us both of those tonight. Her words meant more to me than anything else. For years I had worried that my silence was creating distance between us, that she might begin to see me the way her father described me. Steady, but unimpressive, dependable, but small. But that night proved that she saw me for who I truly was, and she was proud. That pride meant everything. In the days that followed, the silence from Conrad's house was deafening. No calls came, no texts arrived, and no apologies were offered. Devon stayed quiet as well, humiliated by the truth of how his education had been paid for. Helen sent a brief message to Leora, not to me, saying she hoped we could all move on. But there was no anger in their silence, only the stunned realization that their lifeline was gone. They had to face the consequences of years of arrogance and entitlement. At first, part of me worried. I had always believed in helping others, and even after all the insults, cutting off support felt harsh. But then I remembered how Conrad had looked at me when he called me a loser. He had believed it so deeply that he felt entitled to laugh about it in front of my wife and my child. That belief was only possible because I had allowed him to lean on me without demanding respect in return. By stopping it, I was not punishing him. I was teaching him in the only way left that dignity cannot be bought and disrespect will no longer be tolerated. What surprised me most was how light I felt. I had expected guilt. I had expected second-guessing. Instead, I felt stronger, more certain of myself and more present with my own family. Without the constant drain of supporting someone who mocked me, I could focus on building the future I wanted for Leora and Owen. I could finally use my hard work to invest in us, not in keeping another man's pride alive. Owen spoke about it once a few days later when we were sitting on the couch together. He looked up at me with serious eyes and said, "Dad, you're not a loser. You're the strongest person I know." I hugged him tightly, my throat thick with emotion. That moment confirmed that everything I had said at that table mattered. It was not just about reclaiming my dignity. It was about giving him an example of what self-respect looks like. Looking back, I realized that confrontation was not just about a single insult at a Christmas dinner. It was about years of imbalance, years of sacrifice taken for granted, years of silence mistaken for weakness. Standing up that night was a turning point not only for me but for my entire family. It changed how Leora saw me, how Owen would remember me, and how Conrad would be forced to reckon with his own dependence. The lesson I carried forward is simple but powerful. Providing for others means nothing if it costs you your self-worth. Helping family is noble, but when that help becomes fuel for disrespect, it poisons everyone involved. True strength is not just in how much you can carry. It is in knowing when to set the burden down. So if you've ever felt like you were giving and giving while someone mocked you or dismissed you, remember this: your silence may keep the peace, but it will also teach others that your sacrifices are theirs to exploit. The moment you speak the truth, you reclaim not only your dignity but your future. That Christmas dinner marked the end of one chapter in my life and the beginning of another. I walked away, not as the family's silent provider, but as a man who finally demanded the respect he deserved. And in that moment, I became the kind of example I wanted my son to remember for the rest of his life. If this story connected with you, if you felt the weight of those words at that Christmas table, then do me a favor, like this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to finally stand up for yourself? I would love to hear your story. And if you want more powerful real-life stories like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.